I do really want to ask now as we're kind of kicking off. I know I warned you about this, but I saw that article about the rap you've been listening to recently. I'd love to hear like what some of your favorite songs are as we kind of get folks coming in.
Here, I'll be honest. I mean, I'm a dad with 3 kids, so you might, hear them in the background as getting ready for a
Yep,
bedtime routine.
totally.
So there's like the music that I like to listen to, and there's the music that I'm actually listening to right now. So for any parents
Right.
out there, it's like a lot of Blippy excavator songs and like monster truck songs.
Okay. Okay.
No, but me personally, honestly, the weekend recently has been putting me in a good mood. Um, and like more just kind of poppy type stuff. Because when
Yeah.
you're busy, in fact, a lot of the rap music that I usually listen to is to hype me up. And now I kind of need
Okay.
the opposite, is to calm me down. So
Yeah.
kind of more doing kind of poppy type of top hits type of stuff recently. But Joyner Lucas, always kind of is one of the things that I go towards.
He's so
Uh,
good.
yeah, yeah, and some of the songs kind of resonate.
Yeah, I feel that. I definitely hear you though. As far as the pandemic, it's sometimes you just kind of need to chill out and vibe a little bit, and that's definitely been a need for me too. Where I found myself just adjusting quite a few of my leisure activities to just saying, okay, like I need to relax and decompress a little.
Yeah, no, I mean, you may be even hearing my kids, but like
Don't sweat it. That's
basically,
life, right?
oh yeah, it's like, well, that's the thing, right? So like, I mean, people don't realize this, but as a young person, in the legislature, oftentimes the people who are there are retired because they're independently wealthy. So I still have to work multiple jobs. So I'm up at like 5:30. I got music to kind of get me going in the morning. That's kind of
Yeah,
relaxing and calm, and then do my outside of legislative stuff, do my legislative stuff, my extracurriculars, and then this. So music kind of sustains me. Just depends on the mood at the time.
well, why don't we talk a bit about that? I know you've been working with Microsoft for several years. Tell me a bit about your background.
Yeah, so I've been there for about 7 years, and what's interesting is my background is largely in the private sector. So obviously, most known for being in the state senate and the work that we've done there. But most of my career is in the private sector. I've helped start small businesses. I've worked at startups before, and specifically, my background is in strategy and analytics. So a lot of
Awesome.
it was kind of happenstance. So I studied finance, economics, and humanities. So I didn't study computer science, but I was a finance analyst for a long time, and then was really good in Excel. And legit, that's kind of how I
Love it.
got
I
into
love it.
tech. Is I was just really good in Excel. I can model different scenarios, and then kind of went through that route, and then ended up that I was also a decent, project manager for data analytics solutions, and that's kind of where my background is now. Is I work in basically data engineering. So everybody talks about big data and how do we use data to make decision making. That's in fact my job at Microsoft.
You've been ahead of the curve on that one. I mean, the great thing about that is that it really, I think, informs your policy making.
Yeah.
And I've seen that, from the first time you ran for office, from conversations I've had with you. Can you talk a bit about how that background in technology and that background in analysis has informed your work that you've done in the legislature?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways, right? So, like, even from a process perspective, the way that I would go about organizing information to make a decision is very similar to what I would do at my private life at Microsoft as well. So, what's funny is that when I first was elected, I sat down and I took an inventory of every step that it took to pass legislation in Washington State. So I documented every single step. So basically, what any PM would do. And
Yeah,
there's like 150 different steps to pass legislation, a third of which the bills can die. So, like in reviewing the process flow of the legislative of the legislature, realize that there's leverage points that we have to be mindful of, and
totally.
then because of that, advocated to be on certain committees. I serve on rules and whatnot as well. So that's like one. But the other one too is everybody lives in Excel, right? So oftentimes we'll get, information from our staff. They're fantastic. It'll be in Excel, and then I'll just do some modeling on my own as well to kind of get some more refined views. Use that to help figure out like transportation packages. Use that to help figure out policies. So it's good to be able to deep dive in that respect in terms of having that background. But even taking a step back, we could talk about this if you want, but tech policy, just
Mhm.
policy that relates to tech is kind of an interesting dynamic. See
Absolutely.
Sarah Noble's on. Hello.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get some good questions from your colleague. It seems like. I've got a few people showing their support in chat already. So, folks, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in chat here. We're derailing Joe's conversation on tech policy here, though. Sorry.
No, that's good. But here, the other one that's also very fascinating is that right now, especially, we're seeing a whole host of policy as it relates to technology, whether it's data privacy, whether it's facial recognition, whether it's you name it, even data breaches, cybersecurity. And what's fascinating is that happens to be a lot of the stuff that I end up working on at the legislature, along with my colleagues as well. And even though like that particular area may not necessarily be my expertise, the fact that we have a different perspective, the fact that we have different experiences kind of helps inform that as well. So kind of stepping back, it's interesting that the more perspectives you have at the legislature, the better policy becomes. So one of my first bills was a data breach bill, and I was able to work on it with the Attorney General's office and Representative Kloba as well. And it was a kind of a no-brainer for me because as a person that works in tech, especially with data, I know how often it can be compromised. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see how what seemingly was unrelated to the legislature ended up being a huge asset for me. Everything from how I structure the way I do things. We use task boards like you would in tech to manage, the legislative process on my teams. One of the biggest things that people covered when I first got to the legislature was how we set up our office. So I'm not sure if you saw this, but literally the first year that I got in,
I did.
I mean, like I'm a millennial in tech. So like the old stuffy buildings, the wooden, mahogany desk and the heavy drapes just wasn't my thing. So before session started, came in, took out all of the furniture in our office, took it all out. And then usually what happens is when you walk into somebody's office, you see, a bunch of desks, an intern, a session aide may sit out there. It kind of blocks your way. It's not very welcoming. The senator will have a big office, and then the legislative aide will have like with other office as well. So I kind of just tore it all out. I turned our entrance into kind of a break room. So there's like a couch, there's a TV, there's an Xbox, there's an espresso.
Fun actually.
There's tons of snacks. We turned the big office where the senator usually is into like a co-working space. So there's just workstations and obviously food and stuff in there. And I took the small office. So part of it in terms of having a tech background wasn't just policy or kind of ideology. It was just a philosophy of how you do things. You should create a welcoming space to have people give honest and authentic feedback. And also I use like technology to make it more efficient. So we use an app to schedule our meetings and stuff. So I do more meetings than most folks. It's more organized that way too. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic to have that tech background in government. It can make you more efficient, helps you engage more people as well. But also, it could help influence policy.
Totally. Has that app made its way out of your office to other representatives or senators?
It has.
Okay, good.
It's funny. So like there are definitely early adopters who saw it, understood it, and did it. And there's still resistance. There are people even now who still like doing it the old way because, new things can be scary, but
yeah,
it makes it easy for me. So what I end up doing is I have a good process where, my staff, usually if you talk to people who don't use the app, they probably spend like 5 to 6 hours a day scheduling meetings. We don't do that. We just send them a link. And then in the link, we ask for the information in advance. So I have it all at my fingertips. So the day before, I'll go over all of the meetings. I'll read the materials. So that way, when we're in the meeting, we have, a deep dive on that topic. And I'm not just trying to get myself educated. And the reason why that's so important in the legislature is that your meetings are like 15 minutes. I think you've been in a couple, right? So they're like 15 minutes and then you're done. So by the time you understand what's going on, your time is over. So by being prepared in advance, it actually has the ability to get better conversations as well.
Awesome. So we've got a few questions from chat here that I'm going to get to in a minute. But first, I really wanted to know, given this experience that you're bringing to the legislature, where you're saying, look, I have this experience in the private industry that I could bring to do some innovation, make things more efficient. What kind of role do you see for technology in government, given your joint experiences in those areas? And how do you see the role of the tech industry, particularly with our climate and housing crises, which they have a pivotal role to play in?
Yeah. So here in technology and government, we can go. I'll answer this in two parts. The first part is just that the public sector is not known for being efficient as it relates to IT infrastructure, and I'll just put that out there. That's why we had bills on cybersecurity. that's why we have to work through some of these things as well. Like, I'll give you an example. One of the bills that I had this past year had nothing to do with tech. So essentially, it's temporary assistance for needy families. We wanted to make it so that way folks who are on TANF, if there is a pandemic or if unemployment rates are unusually high, that shouldn't count towards their time limit on when they're on TANF. So we just wanted to say, hey, look, if it's during the pandemic and folks aren't able to get jobs because it's a pandemic, that shouldn't count against you. And it was very, very difficult to implement. We had to amend it a little bit just because being able to literally just add time on people's time limit extension was technologically too difficult to do.
Really?
So things like that, yeah. Or even though when you look at social services, oftentimes we'll have clients who are in whatever our education system that then maybe go through our foster care system and other services or something like that. And it's hard to track them through that system to ensure that they're getting the proper resources because there's no master patient index. There's no unified key to kind of help structure all these things. So what's interesting is that we can really use technology to make ourselves much more efficient. And honestly, in the Senate, or I'm sorry, in the legislature, we spend about $1.7 billion at any given point in time on our IT infrastructure, right? So like we need to make sure that
money.
It's a little bit of money, right? So like if we're more efficient with that, imagine what you can do in terms of reinvesting in people and making things more efficient. So, and I think that's great because we have great staff. We have great people that work for the state. I think we should help empower them with some of this stuff as well.
And I'm sure that's true for King County as well.
Yeah. 100%. Every jurisdiction. I've talked to folks in the cities and counties and the higher ups as well. And I'll be honest, I haven't really seen many jurisdictions do it really well. And I've been trying to reach out to other places as well. And it's a variety of things. It's kind of like, fixing a plane while you're flying it. So a lot of these things were built way back in the day using a legacy mainframe. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but swapping them out can be difficult.
No,
but,
I'm embracing it. No, come back in the weeds here. Let's go.
You know what I'm talking about, right? So like if you're deploying something that's in production and any kind of change could break it, you then have to build a concurrent product, right? Which can be kind of expensive and costly. So I would favor moving more towards cloud. So that way it's safer. The technology is always updated. It's easier to govern. It's cheaper as well. And actually it's more probably energy efficient because it's more consolidated. So that's kind of how, I would go about fixing some of those things. But I end up spending a lot of my time talking about basic infrastructure stuff at the state. I also work on the reporting. I'm on a committee that helps on the reporting as well. And they use like Tableau and Power BI, which is what I use as well. So it's fascinating, right? Like I never thought that having a tech background when I was running for office would be a thing. Definitely is a thing. And we could certainly use that to kind of help make ourselves more accountable to the people.
And it's surprisingly rare in the legislature too. There's not that many folks.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it's very, very rare. Yes.
So I think that brings us back to the second thing I was digging into, which is how do you see the role of folks who are in the tech industry and the industry overall in trying to solve some of the crises we're facing as a state, as a county, as a country, whether it's the climate crisis or the housing crisis that we're seeing in places like Seattle and elsewhere?
Well, I think we're all intertwined, right? And like I will say that we're in the Washington area, we do have a good, healthy technology sector. I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen tremendous growth, but that's also one of the reasons why we've seen tremendous inequities in our society as well. So I think there's a huge role to be played by the companies, the people, and also as it relates to the community at large. As it relates to, say, for instance, housing affordability, I think is one of the things that you mentioned. Yep. Right. So like there's certainly not going to be enough resources from the public sector to be able to address all of it. I truly think that we need to focus on those that have the most amount of need. We have a lot of civic properties within Washington State and King County that we could potentially use for more social housing, and then help the private public sector have a partnership in which we can then address kind of the missing middle as well. So I think in terms of housing, we have to be able to use our resources efficiently and effectively. Also, when you look at land use planning, that's one of the key things as it relates to how that might impact climate change as well.
Absolutely.
So knowing and planning on where we're going to have workers, making sure that we have transit associated with that, that can be one of the things that we can do as well. And what's fascinating, this is kind of a tangent, I went to Denmark a couple of years ago, well before the pandemic, to study how they use renewable energy and how they go about lowering carbon emissions. And one of the things that they do is what's called industrial symbiosis. We just passed a bill to allow for it this year, where you use the waste from one industry to help the manufacturing, say, for instance, of another, right? So kind of think of it where, say, for instance, you have a server farm next to
creating circular economic opportunities.
100%, right? You can create circular economic opportunities. You can, say, for instance, use the wastewater. So say, for instance, you're trying to cool down a server farm. You have a cloud computing server farm in one area. You circulate water. The water, obviously, since you're cooling down the heat, is heated up. Now imagine if you go to some manufacturing plant that needed warm water, that didn't have to necessarily use energy to heat it up. It was already done. So that's super esoteric. But if we do things like that, where we're being strategic in terms of even where we site facilities to build and manufacture things, that can be incredibly helpful. So in terms of the tech industry specifically, when you got cloud computing, that's certainly one way that we can address it. The housing and the transportation for the individuals that work there, I think, is another one. Totally. Because it is going to be a big industry. At least it is in Washington State. It could potentially be in other places as well. So, I mean, pick your choice, right? Like, we can address this from a number of ways. I know that there are companies locally, Microsoft and Amazon, looking at becoming net zero carbon emissions. And even then, Microsoft for sure is going towards net zero from the history of when they were created. Yeah. I'm not sure if Amazon is that same way as well. I think they might be. But in that case, right, like, we need to be working together in terms of how do we lower our emissions, because that's the only way that it works.
Totally agree. I do think there are some valid concerns from folks around some of these carbon offsets that these companies are using, though. And I think that we do have to do a better job of tracking those and saying, okay, are these actually getting the carbon out of the atmosphere or stopping carbon from going in that they say they're going to? So that's something big to consider. And then I do want to dig into some of the questions from the chat that we have coming in here. So one question from Martin was, what are your positions on transportation? Particularly Sound Transit has struggled with cost overruns, in particular on the West Seattle connection. And he brings up the aerial gondola alternative, which is
Skylink. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, we've talked to some community members about that as well. And certainly the Sound Transit cost overruns are always going to be difficult. I mean, when you're talking about a big project like that, that spans such a long period of time, there are risks associated with it. And I've been working with them in terms of how do we mitigate some of those impacts. There's still not a clear path in terms of what that could look like. They're still in the planning phase associated with what that is. Everything from addressing, different types of setups in terms of the routes, potentially shifting when some things get constructed. Hopefully that's not the case. Finding other funding mechanisms as well, as long that can be partnered with the federal level, state and local as well. So right now that's kind of TBD. We have talked about a few different proposals that they had regarding land banking and some fees and some cost shifts. But even then, there's a lot more to be done. So I'm, a proponent for actually transit for all, kind of for what we're talking about before. It may sound like a progressive thing to do. It's actually more on the climate side for me, to be honest. So yes, it is more equitable, but the more we can lower our vehicles' miles traveled, that lowers the emissions in Washington State. So in Washington State, transportation is about 44% of the emissions in our state. So if we can lower the emissions by having people use their cars less, that helps everybody out. It makes it more equitable. But you would have to have a connected infrastructure, obviously, with Sound Transit being one of them. So we are in close conversations with our partners at Sound Transit to figure out what the path forward might look like. There's a few different options right now, but I'm very supportive of increasing multimodal. I'm very supportive of making sure that we have infrastructure that allows for us to all be successful.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we both know, emissions from cars and from buildings are the primary drivers of emissions for Washington State and across much of the world, honestly. So can you get specific on what policies you'd implement to change this and how you would get legislative support to make that happen?
Yeah, what's interesting is one of my two first bills was to raise emission standards for cars, and the other one was to raise standards for buildings. So 100% agreed, and that's kind of what we worked on. Yeah. And that was with Representative Dolio, former Representative Dolio. So on the car sector, we need to have the electrification of fleets. We need to have more equitable distribution of EVs and stuff like that. But let's be clear, we need to have, transit in order for people to not have to use their cars in the first place, because
The alternatives
is there. The second one is building standards, and obviously raising the standards for those as well. And I'll just kind of go off to one kind of tangent, is that half of the emissions from a building is actually in the construction of that building. So you would have to employ what's called trying to embody the carbon of the construction of the building itself. Yeah. And luckily, we actually have a
carbon standard, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and luckily, we have a cross-laminate timber factory in Washington State. So there's two things. So by having a cross-laminate timber factory, you can actually reduce the carbon emissions from, say, for instance, the forest industry, because of the dead trees that are there. You can cull them and then make it safer under forest management practices, and then use that technically waste to then use what's called cross-laminate timber, and then build out, say, for instance, more housing. What's interesting is that, I keep saying that, but what's fascinating is that for cross-laminate timber to make sense, you have to build them bigger, but you can pre-manufacture them as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was talking to some folks in building and trades today about like different ways to be innovative and also be focused on climate. And by having cross-laminate timber modular setups, you can have a template, and feasibly you can work with local agencies, King County, to permit these buildings before they're even built. Meaning you can permit them and then have a template that then you can use for other buildings. So instead of getting a permit for every single building,
and permitting is a huge problem.
Permitting is a huge problem because it takes a long time, but it's also very necessary to keep everybody safe and the environment whole. So if you're able to, say, for instance, create template buildings with cross-laminate timber and then have designated areas where you're going to put it, you can streamline the whole process. You can have more affordable housing for cheaper, and you can also raise the number of jobs for workers as well. Yeah. So for me, when we talk about climate, when we talk about building, transportation, our economy, they're all related. They are all related.
And as you point out, these issues are not only intersectional, but they're ones where we have some identified pain points that we can actually hit on. So, one, the permitting process for buildings can be a huge choke point. Supply, if we can encourage demand for cross-laminated timber, there'll be an increase in supply that happens because of that. We can also, provide incentives for the industry to grow. So there's definite opportunities there. I totally agree.
Yeah.
I do want to dig a bit more deeply into the role of King County Executive, which is obviously what you're running for. We had a question. It's actually from my dad, I noticed. As a state senator, you're aware of key issues that affect our community. Making the transition from a legislature to being an executive, though, requires a pivot in administrative skills. How will you make that pivot to being an executive?
Yeah, no, here, what's also interesting is oftentimes if you look at the backgrounds of the folks who are executives now, they're most often lawyers who then go into public service because they had access to the political field, and then they ran for an executive position. That's like the majority of people. Very rarely do executives actually have executive experience before they ran for that role.
But PM experience might be good.
Yeah, what's that?
PM experience might be useful, though.
I don't disagree with you. And what's funny is that most people see my body of work in the legislature, and that's kind of the framing in which they see it. Mm-hmm. They don't see the decades of experience in the private sector as well. So having worked in tech for over a decade, having started small businesses, having managed teams and managed millions and hundreds of millions of dollars as well. So if you look at the whole body of work in which I've been responsible for and still responsible for now, I actually have more executive experience than most of the executives who were first elected into their roles. And even then, if you look at kind of my day-to-day operations, the fact that I work at Microsoft and also in the legislature at the same time and do both at a pretty high level, kind of shows that I think we have the ability to lead and manage teams as well. So, but I completely agree. It's a completely different mindset. And having now worked with, all jurisdictions of executives, from the governor's office to the mayor's office to the county and other folks, I feel like I have a pretty good, at least perspective in terms of what's required to be an executive leader. And candidly, I think that's really what we need in Washington State, are folks who can execute. We have fantastic leaders in Washington State. We're very lucky to have legislators who are very passionate about particular roles. What I care about is making things work. on the
Let's get things
operational
done.
side.
Yeah.
Getting things done, right? Like
Yeah.
we have great leaders that we can be uplifting and amplifying their voices. I want to make sure potholes are filled. I want to make sure that our buses are running on time. I want to make sure that we're hitting our goals that are set for us by the legislature. I want to make sure that the culverts are being fixed. I want to do all those things that makes the quality of life of communities better. And when you look at the body of work that I want to work on, whether it's police accountability, whether it's access to transit, whether it's climate change, a lot of that stuff happens at the county level. So
Absolutely.
being able to be in that space is really why I want to run for exec, because even right now, we are at a once in a generation opportunity to create systemic change, truly systemic change. And candidly, just being in the roles that I've been in the past few years, it's really hard for people to create systemic change when they benefit from that system. We have to think different than what we were doing before. We can't just keep doing the same things and think that we're going to do better. I love reading reports, and the county does a great job at putting out reports. There are fantastic staff who have great ideas that have put out great reports in the past as well. There was a climate change report back in 2015, and we haven't met those goals just yet, right? Like we need to address police accountabilities now as well. We have all these things coming down from the state, from CETA to the new climate policies that are put in place that have to be implemented at the county. So having a good relationship with our neighboring suburban cities, with the legislature, with the state level officials, I think is going to be crucial to be able to meet these goals and to ensure we get things done. But it's going to take a mind shift for us to make that happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, let's dig a bit more deeply into that team element and team leadership that you talked about, because that's obviously a strength you bring to this. To pivot that a bit, we had a question from Alan on Facebook. Would you encourage companies to have hybrid work schedules? So, a mix of remote and in person. I would love to hear what you think of that idea.
100%. And just for the record, I did drop a 4-day work week bill. Obviously, didn't go anywhere because we don't have it just yet. But I do think that that's the future, right? So,
all right. Well, let me add one more thing then. Do you think we should have a 4-day work week where, if you were doing it, would you prefer to work, say, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, so you have the Wednesday off, or are you looking for a 3-day weekend? What do you think?
Oh, I mean, in my mind, I was thinking like a Monday to Thursday, but I would leave that the discretion of the employer and the employee to figure it out, because it would really depend on the industry. So some industries, what's funny, we talked to some folks in retail where they do a 4-day work week. It's staggered, so that way the operation is covered. So it depends on the industry in terms of what you want. But yes, I would encourage companies.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And also, this is a good question by Alan as well. So kind of what we're talking about before in terms of how things relate to climate change. Having a hybrid work schedule means that we have people less people on the roads. Microsoft did a 4-day work week trial in Japan, and not only did they see productivity increase, they also saw like consumption of energy and paper and stuff go down in their building. So by having a hybrid work schedule, in my opinion, a 4-day work week, you can also increase productivity because people are more engaged, they're more rested. And you can even lower the impacts of CO2 emissions because you're not driving to work, you're not using energy to heat that building, and you're not using, whatever materials to be used in that building as well.
Awesome.
And just to be clear, it's unique to every single industry, right? So like we have to talk about that in whether it's the hospitality, whether
it won't always work. There's no one size fit all.
Yeah, exactly.
So we had another question coming in from your colleague here. Will you share your ideas for supporting King County through the pandemic as executive?
I think so first off, Senator Nobles is one of the greatest. I can't say is the greatest because then I look biased, but I think she is the greatest asset that we have coming into the legislature this past year. Her voice truly transformed the conversation. It was such an honor to be able to work with such a powerful, strong person to pass great policies that help people. So I'm gonna put that out there first. The other one is really the pandemic exposed a lot of the inequities that our system has already been facing. A lot of the people who were not in part of the political process before saw that. A lot of the disparities that we saw happening before saw that as well.
Totally.
So in terms of, as an executive, trying to get King County through this pandemic, one of the things, and we can go into policy specific, but honestly, it's pretty basic, is we need to engage community members. People who are impacted by policies, people who are impacted by the pandemic, we need to be engaging them to help us figure out the way through. And I say that because oftentimes when you look at leadership in general, you'll see folks who make a decision, and then instead of engaging with community, they're having a good time in the bath. Instead of
I can tell.
engaging in the community, they will then just tell people after the fact and think that's good enough. And we saw that go south pretty quickly. So there are a number of issues that we know truly impact our communities, whether it's public health, whether it's homelessness, whether it's access to transportation, things like that, where we have to make sure that they are a part of the process from the get-go. One of the things that the King County Executive is going to be going and doing next year is helping select the next sheriff. And under my office, we will see community-based decisions in terms of how the sheriff will be selected, versus just making the decision and going forward as well. So that's one of the biggest things. But supporting King County through the pandemic is truly reaching out and having these tough conversations with communities. Oftentimes just being heard is really the crux that is missing. When I've talked to folks in terms of how we could have better served their communities, a lot of it is, hey, we wish that we had somebody talk to us about where to allocate these things. We know where to go.
Right.
So there's a lot of community-based solutions that we're not quite engaging with, because it is hard. It is hard to have that one-on-one, but it requires effort and requires us to be humble and requires us to listen.
Well, and to your point, that effort gets done when it's a very rich, often white neighborhood that, wants to stop a major housing development from coming in. But on all these other issues, if it's a neighborhood that's maybe not as well off, or, it has as more people of color in it, there is a major disparity in that kind of outreach and also just access to it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm from White Center, right? So I was born and raised in King County in White Center. And there was a situation that happened where they were making a decision on behalf of the community. And I didn't even disagree. I just said, hey, there's a history of distrust. So can you please just make sure you make a couple of phone calls before this is announced? There was no phone calls. It was announced. Things did not go very well. It's things like that where, you don't have to overthink how we help people. Literally listen to them and then do that thing. Like that could be as basic as what it is. We heard it with the vaccine distributions, right? Like we're very lucky in King County to have overall a good process for vaccine distributions eventually. Thankfully for our public health officials and our nurses and stuff like that. But one of the biggest problems was that communities of color were left out. People who didn't have access to healthcare were left out. So oftentimes what we need to do to get ourselves through a pandemic should have happened before a crisis happens. We need to be engaged in communities and having these relationships in advance as well. So for the next one, making sure that those things are in place, understanding where we lack infrastructure and resources before they actually happen, and making sure that we build them up so that when the next pandemic happens, knock on wood, it doesn't happen for hundreds of years, we are prepared.
Yeah, and I think that gets back to some of the stuff you're saying about infrastructure, right? Like there's a multitude of different ways that we can build infrastructure. It doesn't have to just be, roads, bridges, transportation. It can also be IT infrastructure, like you
broadband.
Broadband, absolutely. Huge topic of the legislature this year. It can be healthcare infrastructure, as you pointed out. And so there's definitely some major opportunities for that. And I think one of the reasons that you're running for office, because as it says on your website, is that, after years of setting these aggressive climate goals, King County's leadership has failed to actually enact the policies that will actually meet those targets. They're failing on this crucial infrastructure question. How will you change that paradigm as King County Executive?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, look, we have great people working for the county. I've seen their work up close, and I'm very blown away by the skills and experience that are there. I think what we need is to uplift them, and also for the leaders to just do the work as well. Very often we'll set these lofty goals and then we'll do something that's performative, or at the very least, like not sufficient, right? So like in order for us to tackle our carbon goals, it's good that we're replacing the bus fleet. That's not enough. We need to do more, right? Like it's good for us to buy some hotels. That's fantastic. That's not enough. We need to do more. We have to think about this from a holistic perspective, and using our money wisely is one of the key points for that as well. So I'm just going to point out real quick that 73% of the general fund for King County, 73% of the general fund of King County is spent on our criminal legal system. Not infrastructure, not alleviating homelessness, not for human services. So we have to rethink how we spend our money to address some of these goals.
Absolutely.
But at least from the county perspective on climate, making sure that climate is part of our land use planning, including that as part of the GMA, so that when we develop our transportation infrastructure, it is being done in mind with our housing infrastructure, which is being done in mind with our economic development as well. And there are already great plans, and there's reports that I've read that have talked about doing that. Literally, we just need to do it. We need folks who are in charge to push. And I'll just give you one piece of insight I'll notice is that legislators oftentimes will be in a position of power, and then they can say that they want something done. But unless you're having a legislator who is pushing and really advocating for something, you can't just defer, right? So staff is looking towards the legislators to lead. The legislators are looking to staff for something to figure it out. But at the end of the day, the best plan doesn't matter if the person who is in charge isn't implementing them. Right. So again,
It's in Seattle.
Right. So it's like we can talk ourselves in a circle all we want, and there's plenty of reasons to find excuses not to do something, but it takes bold leadership to actually do it. And that's kind of what has been our MO while in the legislature. We talked about all these lofty goals on progressive revenue, talked about these lofty goals on climate, talked about, these things that we cared about on social justice.
But what do we actually do?
Yes. So we need to actually do it. And we've been passing legislation at the state level, and I think implementation happens at the county. And now we just need to actually address them.
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to think about it. So digging into that a bit more deeply, how will your climate policies around buildings be implemented in concert with policies to address the housing crisis and to increase transportation? How will that intersection work?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So we have a lot of civic properties, also known as surplus lands in King County specifically and across the state. We can take inventory of where they are and potentially use our land use in order to be able to develop them out, again, with cross-laminated timber, being mindful of transit at the same time. So we do have the resources and the capacity to be able to do that. And also if we need to work with private organizations as well. So I truly think that to address our affordability issues, we have, I think the last estimate was hundreds of thousands of units that need to be built just to address the current demand, right? So there's certainly a lot that could be done. But whenever you talk about land use and density, it becomes a bit trickier. So I sign up to all of the density bills, even when they're not politically popular, because I know that it's more important to get people housed and address this homelessness crisis. Totally. So we have to look and partner with our local jurisdictions, because the county is limited depending on where it's at, to ensure that we have zoning and land use policies in place. Be able to use the resources that we currently have. Thank you, Ace. 196,000 currently that we need to be able to address our shortage of housing. Using our infrastructure that we already have, right? So like it's going to take. There's no magic answer. Literally, we're going to have to do a lot of different things in different places, and we have to work together. So the fact that 8 jurisdictions chose not to sign up for the regional plan to address homelessness is a sign that we need to make sure that we have some conversations. The fact that there isn't enough trust between jurisdictions is a sign. And sometimes that takes humility, right? Like it needs to be us coming and saying, hey, look, this is what we're thinking, but what are you thinking? How can we address this? I've had some of these conversations with folks, and it's been pretty eye-opening in the sense that they just want to be heard. So we do need to have these aggressive goals. We have to do it
talked about earlier
with our communities. Yeah, exactly. And it has to be based off of trust. And you know what's funny? Even being one of the more progressive legislators in Washington State, and my policies and my values are very clear, I surprisingly have a good relationship with members across the aisle, even when I disagree with them. And oftentimes it's because I'm willing to have the conversation and I don't actually BS, right? So when I talk to folks, these are my values. This is what I believe. This is what I think we need to happen. Let's have a conversation. And the surprising part is that a high percentage of the times we actually will agree on these things. So it's not impossible to do, but it does take work for us to have these conversations. I will say that 93% of the bills in Washington State last year, 93% were in fact bipartisan. So we can do this together, right? So we can do this.
We have to have hard conversations. We have to put the work in. We have to do outreach. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the answer, right? Like there is no shortcut for those conversations. There's no shortcut for the outreach. And honestly, even if you have the best plan in place, and you were to put it out there, if you don't have that trust, it's not going to work.
Totally. So I think this is a great segue to talk about, as you mentioned, trying to work across jurisdictions. So Random Place on YouTube asked, what influences do you think passing these climate policies in King County would have on any other counties in Washington, if any?
Oh, not just other counties. Look, King County is the 12th largest county in the United States.
Yeah.
King County is bigger than 14 states. 14 states.
That's a
So
wild
if
stat.
we were able to do some of these policies in King County, we would have tremendous influence, not just in Washington state, but across the nation. So one of the hardest things in the legislature is when you try to implement something new or something that is, a big, hairy goal. People will always look to see what other jurisdictions have done, what other places have done, to try to see what the success looked like for those organizations or for those jurisdictions. If we did some of these things in King County, a lot of the doubt, there's a lot of places that want to do something similar, but they aren't sure because they don't have the ability. I'll answer your question about homelessness as well. They don't have the ability to take that risk. So what's interesting is if we're able to implement these in King County, I think you can be a beacon for other places. And it sounds like the question, so first off, the question was about climate. So I'm going to stick with that. But there are things that we can do locally to help mitigate the impacts of climate change.
Yeah, and then it sounds like Random was also asking about, like similar to that, like what are things we could do about homelessness that we could then bring to a more regional or countrywide impact by, as you pointed out, the example of the 12th largest county in the country.
Yeah, well, there are many causes of homelessness, and I think we need to attack the root causes of homelessness, which is, to me, economic insecurity. At any given point in time, I think there's about 25,000 people in King County who are on the verge of homelessness or very insecure. Wow. We've all heard that stat before, right? Like whatever, 50% of Americans have less than $100.
$700 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. A nominal amount in their bank accounts. And because of that, that's why they go into homelessness. It is 3 times cheaper to keep somebody housed than it is to take them out of homelessness. We have to tackle the root causes of homelessness before they get there in the first place. And I will point out that back in the 70s and 80s, we used to spend the same amount of money on basic needs programs, on human services, as we did on the criminal legal system. The same amount.
That has changed.
But because of the war on drugs, because of tough on crime policies, we now spend the majority of our money on the criminalization of the root causes of poverty, right? So
what was the number you said earlier for King County? 72%?
73% of the general fund. Yeah, of the general fund. So the flexible amount that the county has to spend goes towards that. So instead of solving for the root causes of poverty, we've instead just criminalized it. Yeah. So it does a couple of things. First off, it's inequitable because we know that there are racial disparities in terms of how our legal system works. But also, instead of keeping people housed, we're just criminalizing them. It does not work. So we can't keep using that as well. I think that's one of the biggest things that we can shift away from. Is it is politically scary for folks to be seen as not tough enough, right? But if we're able to make some of these decisions and show that there's a better way, I think that in itself can be a beacon for other areas. But we've already started. And it can't be done in any one jurisdiction. It needs to be done holistically. It's reforming our tax code. It is making sure that it's less regressive. So in Washington state, we've made significant strides towards progressive tax reform. We've made significant strides towards, say, for instance, the working families tax credit to lower the tax burdens on the families needed the most. We've increased funding for what's called TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. We've created a dedicated funding stream for housing and affordability. So those are some of the systemic things we need to address. The county also needs to address things like behavioral health, our legal system, things like that. So we can't look at it from just one perspective. It is the whole system that needs to change. The whole system needs to change. And the fact that we had such a successful legislative session, to me, was partially a testament to the fact that this was also the most diverse legislature in the history of Washington State.
Added Senator Nobles and plenty of others you mentioned.
100%. The people who are impacted by policies are now at the table discussing how we should solve them. So there have been tremendous amounts of effort from the community and advocates for decades. I totally get that. But now that you have people who are at the table who understand the implications and will fight to fix it, that's the key that we've had. And one thing I will point out is that we don't have enough renters in the legislature. And the fact that we can't pass stronger tenant protections is a function of not having enough renters. So I will point that out.
Do you think that that's basically just a function of the fact that it's a part-time legislature and we should?
Oh yeah, it's super inequitable, right? Like it is very hard. It is very hard running for office. It is very hard being in office, but it is absolutely important for you to do it. It is especially hard if you're a woman, a person of color, a first of your kind. So when I was running for office, I happened to be the very first Vietnamese state senator in the history of Washington state. I happened to be the first person of color to ever represent the 34th legislative district, despite it including White Center and Burien, two very diverse communities. And the reason why there is just systemic, right? Systems of power tend to reflect the people who created them. And oftentimes when you're running for office, it isn't so much about who's the most qualified or competent, it's who can get the political support and enough money to run a campaign. So when I ran for office, I didn't take corporate PAC money, and people thought that I had no chance because I wasn't going to get the political support because I'm not from the political establishment, and then I wasn't going to be able to raise enough money. Therefore, I would never win. They were right 2 out of 3 times, ended up winning in a landslide because we did things different. Politics has to change for policy to change, for the people who are there to be able to reflect the values of the community as well. So
I think sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I think it shows throughout everything you've said here, right? We've talked about, the very first thing we talked about was you trying to identify how can we make my office in the legislature, now that I'm in office, more responsive and more open and more accepting of people to come in and give their input. Talked about, reaching out to the community, making sure we actually go talk to folks when we're, trying to do new development or when we're trying to implement policy. You talked about, reaching across the aisle or talking to other folks who are within your own party or, independents and saying, okay, how can we have a conversation and really talk about the details? So I definitely see that within everything you've done, whether it's the running for office, the implementation, how you speak about the issues. It's very clear you have this idea of, we need to listen to each other and actually communicate. And I love that. I think it's such a skill and it's something that would serve you well as an executive.
No, thank you so much. And I just want to be like, you can't just do it when the cameras are on. You can't just do it when there's a press conference, right? Like I spent 3 hours today in a tax structure work group, right? Like that is where the rubber meets the road, where you're talking about different scenarios. Like I have a meeting
for those who are just listening on audio, he is lighting up talking about tax structures.
So my team thinks I'm wild. So like legitimately, like most people go home and they like watch Netflix to kind of hang out and relax. I will download reports, whether it's the state or county, and I just go through them. They're fantastic. There are so many great reports out there of things that we should be doing that we can do better. That's what blows my mind is that nothing that I'm saying is actually unique or transformative. They're all already planned out and written down.
It's implementation.
Yeah.
Well, again, PM skills, right? Program management.
It's easy to talk about goals. It's harder to reach them.
Yeah. So we got a couple questions I want to get to here. One was about from Sydney on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, Sydney. Do you have a plan to revitalize Seattle and King County's art culture and promote film production, particularly post-pandemic? Because obviously that's been a huge problem.
Oh, huge. And thank you so much, Sydney. What's funny, one of the startups that I used to work in, I managed a media team, and there was a company that ended up spinning off because of it as well. So I happen to know a decent amount of people in that space, and it is incredibly difficult for them. In fact, there was a company that became so successful, they ended up looking towards, say, for instance, Georgia because of the tax breaks that are there. They didn't end up doing it, but that's one of the things. I will point out that I'm generally against tax breaks for large corporations, but if it's to specifically help our arts community, I would be in favor of it. I've drafted legislation in previous years to have a fund for the revitalization of arts and culture, not just in Seattle, but Washington State as a whole. Obviously, because of the COVID pandemic, that was kind of put on hold. But there's a whole host of things that we should be doing. Everything from incentivizing projects to be here, augmenting some of the resources that we already have, but also being smart with where we build sound stations as well. And that's not meant to knock anybody. I know that there's a new sound station that's being put in there, and I was talking to people in the arts community and the film production community specifically about it. And it's funny because they were like, oh, we knew about that. We didn't ever use it previously because it's so close to the train tracks that there's
Oh
no
no.
that you can ever get a clean sound. So it's like, again, listen to the communities who are impacted on
Yeah.
what they
Oh
want
god.
and what they need in order for them to be successful, and go with it. And candidly, it is sometimes having a financial incentive for us to be there. We did the same thing for the tech industry. We did the same thing in terms of building out infrastructure in South Lake Union. We could do the same thing for the arts community, because if you look at, sorry, this is the reason why I get so fired up about the arts community, is you look at the way that trends are happening in our workforce and economic growth. A lot of the roles that we're seeing that used to be high-paying jobs no longer exist,
Yes.
or they can move around. But when you
And
look
with
at
the digital attention economy now.
exactly,
Yeah.
right? So if you look at what the future of our economy could look like, I think it would be in the creative space. I think it could be in the art space, because that's just the nature of the way things are growing.
Right.
So,
As we automate things, whether it's, with machine learning and AI or robotics, we're going to free up a lot of labor that's been doing these tasks that are, by hand or just take a lot more time. You're seeing it. Hell, you're seeing in the legal space, even where folks, I think, didn't expect that.
accounting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
think, I remember which episode it was on. I think maybe like Vice or something, where they had a lawyer versus an AI go through a document, and the AI was faster.
oh yeah, way faster. And so
Yeah.
there's a ton of stuff that this is really revolutionizing in it. So it's freeing up humans from a lot of the, I don't want to call them menial tasks, but a lot of these tasks that we've been doing for a long time to hopefully enable that creativity. So we'll see.
Yeah. And just to be clear, the goal is not to get rid of these jobs per se. It's to make sure that
Right.
we're investing in people. And honestly, that's
Make it more
probably why
efficient.
more efficient. That's why I support a 4-day work week and a universal basic income, because
Yes.
then we can
Yeah.
focus on quality of life and investing in people, and not just serving something like that. Also, in the arts community too, selfishly speaking, I think that's a great way to engage youth and to help
Mhm.
prep people for the future. So instead of spending so much money, say for instance, on our legal system, if we put that money towards the arts and culture, you can help educate people on the community, help them grow. I grew up playing jazz growing up. I don't play jazz now. So yeah, I was big alto sax, first
Okay.
chair, did my thing.
So you got the guitar in the corner though. So hey,
I do a little Martin guitar. Yeah. So like this is, I don't know, maybe this is a bit privileged, but like I think that was actually one of the most formative things for me growing up, was having access to the arts. It was actually a good way to structure the way that I thought. It was a great way to release my creativity, and because of that, I think it made me a better person. So, in addition to the economic benefits of supporting our arts community, I think it just makes you a better person, and having that culture makes the community better.
Absolutely. Well, as a couple folks have asked in chat, I think there are some other questions around the mass timber stuff you brought up there. Sorry, I was just finding the question here. But Alan asked, and this is a follow-up on the mass timber stuff we talked about, but I didn't have a chance to get to it, was what measures would you do for worker safety, I think more generally, but also in particular for lumber yards, et cetera? What would you say should be implemented?
Well, L&I, right? Like L&I think we can, first off, workers' rights are paramount, and making sure that we're doing things mindful of their safety is key. And I think one of the biggest things is having a robust L&I team to kind of help make sure that those safety protocols are in fact being met. So one of the things you can do for safety is just making sure that the protocols that we have in place are currently being followed. Certainly hard hats for lumber yards employees and whatnot as well. But that's probably one of the biggest things, is allow L&I to be able to make sure that the sites are in fact safe.
Awesome. And then we had another question from Norman Sigler. And that was, first off saying thank you, but also asking, how long would it take you to meet these goals as King County Executive, and how long would you expect to be King County Executive to meet those goals?
Knock on wood, if I was so lucky. And thank you so much, Norman, as well. There are a lot of lofty goals, so it kind of just depends on which one. But the climate goals, getting to net zero carbon emissions, if we're still talking about this by 2050, we're too late. It's screwed, right? So like we're talking in the next decade or two in order to make systemic change to alleviate our CO2 emissions. Homelessness. We've been talking about homelessness for over a decade. It's been an emergency for over a decade. And I really do like the regional approach. I do like the new authority being set up. However, we need to act with more urgency as well. So that should be met, in 5 to 10 years, because we've already been doing it for over 10 years as well.
Right.
So it depends on which particular one. What I will say is that we need to act more urgently, and the deadline should be like 5 years ago, in terms of where we should have been in terms of addressing some of these issues.
As
so,
you point out, we've done the studies, right? We have the information.
Done it. Like, you could look up online. There literally was a study in 2015 to how to address our climate goals in King County. Have they been met? Unfortunately not, but we can do better. We have the resources here. There's no excuse for us not to be able to do these things, especially in Washington State. We have the resources. We have the political will. There are literally some of the wealthiest people to ever live in the history of humanity who live here now, because of the abundance of resources that we have here, including the people. I think we need to have vision for our future that reflects what it could be for our democracy and for our county. And I would be, happy to be exec for as long as the county would have me, in terms of as long as we're meeting our goals. But what I will say is that I would like to make myself obsolete, right? So one of the things that I always say, a great leader doesn't just do good things. They empower other people to be successful as well. So it is not enough for just one person to do something. You have to be building the bench. You have to be building a roster of other great leaders to be able to do these things. So honestly, it would be great to be King County Executive for as short as possible, because that means we met our goals. That means other people are willing to step up. If there was somebody that I thought was in the community who would do a better job, I would immediately step back and help uplift them, right? Our goal is to make sure that there are other people who are doing this as well, because no one person can make this happen. This is more than any one person. This is more than any one seat. It's how we can be an example for other people to be successful. When I first ran for Senate, one of my mentors, she knows who she is, made a comment that said, "Do not mess this up." She said it in a different word. And largely it's because when you're a person of color, or when you're the first of something, your actions reflect other people as well. So if you see me kind of overdo things, if you see me get super amped up, if you see me take more meetings than I should or not sleep as much as I should, is because I know that we don't have time to address all of these things, and we need to make a path for other people to be successful as well. And that's, the role of the King County Executive, I think, is really be that bully pulpit to say, we got to address climate change now. And then, yes, that's great. We're going to buy some buses, but we're also going to change our land use policies. We're going to work with our agriculture community to see how we can use the soil to sequester carbon. We're going to fix our waterways. We're going to take care of these noxious weeds to increase salmon habitat. We're going to test out new renewable energy technologies, including tidal, solar, and wind. We're going to make it easier to site energy facilities. We're going to clean up our wastewater. You know what I mean? Like, there are all these things that we can be doing that, in fact, are not actually that sexy. They're just operational. And if you get some of those things done, you can free up the capacity for everything else. That's what I want to do. I want to take care of all the little things so we can reach out and take even bigger goals in the future.
Well, let's talk operations really quick then. For folks who want to get involved in making your campaign happen, I know your website's meetjoenguyen.com, but what are the ways they can get engaged or follow what you're doing?
Yeah, no, and thank you so much, because we've had an awesome start. Obviously, fundraising is always going to be the biggest deal for us because we don't take corporate PACs. So that's going to be a huge key. So go to the website. We've also had over 125 or 130 people sign up to volunteer already. We've started phone banking. We started engaging in direct contact. We're going to start field once it's appropriate after June, given the CDC updates and stuff as well. So go to our site, sign up to volunteer. Obviously, we'd love your support and the contribution, or even hosting an event. So we're going to start doing those remotely. We're going to have a campaign launch January 6th as well at MLK Park.
You mean June 6th, just to clarify?
June 6th, I'm sorry. Yeah, too hyped up. June 6th. So there are a multitude of ways to get involved right now. You can be as engaged or as not engaged as you want. All your skill sets are welcomed. If you're good with graphic design, fantastic. If you're good with digital communications, fantastic. If you want to make phone calls, that's fantastic. If you want to put stamps on envelopes, that's fantastic too. We're certainly up against a big challenge right now, but I feel very good because I think people truly want to see things get better for all of us. And right now we have a once in a lifetime opportunity to do that as we get past this pandemic, whether it's COVID, racial inequities, climate change, we can change it right now.
As you pointed out earlier, now is the time for systemic change. Now is our opportunity.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That went
Yeah.
by really fast. It's like an hour already.
Yeah, that was an hour almost on the dot. That was I appreciate you coming on. It's a lot of fun, and I'll get you the edited episode up on the podcast sometime in the next couple of weeks here. So
awesome. And thank you for everybody for following and listening to my kids, take a shower.
You did great. You handled the kids screaming really well. I hate to say it, but I could tell it happens occasionally because you're like, oh yeah, this is a thing.
It's for every parent out there. It is okay and it's totally normal. And like, that's life. That's life as a legislator. That's how you you can't wait for the opportune time to do something. You got to do it when it's time.
Absolutely. Well, folks, thanks for tuning in. Joe, thank you so much for coming on. And I'm going to end the broadcast here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
You too. Bye.